Hello, class. Um, Today, this is part two of lecture. This is going to cover race and the cultural construction of race and racial relationships and racial hierarchies. Again, this is a very significant chapter because it shifts us into looking at how our cultures chain us and bind us to perceptions of reality that do not exist. So that's your Professor Wesh uses a couple different examples of blindness, and he uses Brian Bushway as a great example of how we manifest, how we create our reality. So I'm going to play a couple of segments of this documentary. I think it's located in your book itself, and we'll talk about it.
At a loss. I was at a loss, and I really did feel very limited. I couldn't find my way out of my room. And how was I then going to figure out ways to navigate the world? It was a completely overwhelming thought. And it threw me into an identity crisis of where do I fit in life? What does it mean to be a whole human being? Nobody really wants to deal with you anymore. And so you really feel this tension of exclusion, and it happens because we all think if we can't see, we can't do anything. This is the constant struggle that I find myself socially always in, is that people are underestimating my full capacity of what I can do. The first steps of getting outside into the world was being introduced to the white cane. The cane is great for information up close, but the cane is limiting to what only the cane can touch.
So Brian, he was this ordinary kid that was playing hockey and doing just kid-like things, normal kid things, and suddenly he could not follow the puck. And the doctor told him that his optical nerves were deteriorating, and yes, indeed, he eventually did go blind. So he had this period of being with sight and then without it. And you know, that is something that there's other examples, of course, of people who were born blind that overcome their blindness. And Robert A. Scott wrote a great book about the making of blind man, or the radical idea that blind people can't do anything, and that is a social construction, because there's great examples of people overcoming their blindness. So you have this belief that is connected to the behaviors, which is connected to social structure. So the belief is that blind people cannot do anything. They have to be limited in what they are able to do. Behavior is blind people don't do those things that they're thought not to be able to do. And then you have the social structure in which institutions are created to help blind people do the things that they're told that they cannot do. So that is, in essence, you have the belief that blind people are limited, behavior that blind people do not engage in certain things because of that belief, and then institutions that support it. So here's back to Brian.
I had learned the route to my 8th grade class, and I was walking by myself with my cane, and I was just walking down the center of the hallway, but I could tell that there was a pillar and then an open space and a pillar and an open space. I swear I could see these things, and I touched them to confirm what they were. It was a pillar. What I was doing was passively echolocating these objects. It's human sonar.
Echolocation is a term that biologists use to refer to the ability that some animals like bats and dolphins have to use sounds that they produce themselves to create echoes bouncing off things in the world around them and to use.
So studies have shown that their visual cortex actually lights up when they are echolocating. It's they are literally creating an image with sound, and they are basically seen acoustically.
Echolocation gave me real connection to my physical environment, which then gave me greater freedom to my social environment. The better I was at mobility, the easier it was to make friends and to do things with people.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Everybody has something to learn from echolocation, and that is that we all are capable of so much more than we previously thought.
So that is the essence of this class, is it not? The human potential is limited by culture and the constraints that it places on us is something that we can overcome, and as Brian has so greatly demonstrated. So let's continue on, if I can get my PowerPoint to operate. April 4th, 1968, a moment in time that if you were living during the time, I was not. I was born in August 3rd, 1968, so I was yet to be out in the world. But it's kind of like 9/11. I do remember 9/11, the moment, and I know where I was, and it's something that's scarred in the memory of the collective conscious. And MLK, of course, represented something great to overcoming the constraints of their social order at the time. And really, school teachers and educational professionals across the country grappling with how to deal with this. And Jane Elliott this is a documentary that's a classic documentary that has a couple different episodes to it, actually, but this one is called Class Divided, and it sort of plays through what happened. So the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated, she went into her class and decided to run an experiment, and this is what she did.
Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Since I'm the teacher and I have blue eyes, I think maybe the blue-eyed people should be on top the first day. I mean, the blue-eyed people are the better people in this room. Oh, yes, they are. Blue-eyed people are smarter than brown-eyed people.
My dad isn't that stupid.
Is your dad brown-eyed?
Yeah.
One day you came to school and you told us that he kicked you.
He did.
Do you think a blue-eyed father would kick his son?
Yeah. My dad's
blue-eyed. He's never kicked me. Greg's dad is blue-eyed. He's never kicked him. Rex's dad is blue-eyed. He's never kicked him. This is a fact. Blue-eyed people are better than brown-eyed people. Are you brown-eyed or blue-eyed?
No.
Why are you shaking your head?
I don't know.
Are you sure that you're right? Why? What makes you so sure that you're right?
I don't know.
The blue-eyed people get 5 extra minutes of recess, while the brown-eyed people have to stay in. The brown-eyed people do not get to use the drinking fountain. You'll have to use the paper cups. You brown-eyed people are not to play with the blue-eyed people on the playground because you are not as good as blue-eyed people. Well, the brown-eyed people in this room today are going to wear collars so that we can tell from a distance what color your eyes are. On page 127. 127. Is everyone ready? Everyone but Laurie. You ready, Laurie?
Brown-eyed.
She's a brown-eyed. You'll begin to notice today that we spend a great deal of time waiting for brown-eyed people.
So she plays this out through the course of days. Actually, she reverses it in days coming. And what she finds is that in this case, that afternoon, they came back to the classroom after recess, and she gave them a test in the afternoon that the blue-eyed people did worse, and the brown-eyed people did worse, and then the blue-eyed people did better. And then whenever the blue-eyed people had to wear the collar, the success rates reversed itself. So these stereotypes that prime us towards success and failure are something that Jane Elliott has done this experiment in contexts all over the world now. She's quite famous for this, and she's gone into corporations and businesses and other contexts to demonstrate it. So triad of beliefs, realization of our realities. You got belief, you got behavior, you've got social structure, and these three, of course, are playing into each other to create our reality. So if you look at our reality when it comes to the racial gap, wealth gap, this reality is quite severe. Blacks have 12 cents for every dollar a white person has. Latinos have 21 cents. So poverty is extreme as far as relationship from blacks to whites. And in healthcare, blacks are, as far as maternal deaths, maternal births, the deaths at birth, infant mortality. Forgive me, I'm trying to get through this COVID myself. 10.8 versus white Americans 4.6 per 1,000 live births. So we're talking about twice the amount of births, and so we're talking about poverty, folks. This is healthcare poverty. And if you look at COVID, it has definitely impacted the African American population quite dramatically. Not as much as the indigenous population, interesting enough, but definitely more so than other groups. And then if you look at poverty is created by jobs, and the absence of jobs, and the presence of jobs, certain types of jobs that are allowed and certain types of jobs that aren't. There was a study done in the early 2000s by the University of Chicago that was entitled in the article that was written was, "Are Emily and Brendan more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal?" What they did is they sent out 5,000 resumes that were the same, but they just put different names on them. Emily and Brendan being more similar to white names, and Lakeisha and Jamal, of course, being African American. And 50% more interviews were given to Brendan and Emily, the exact same. So do not tell me that there is not a bias out there towards racial groups. And so what we have to unpack just a bit is what we call whiteness and the privilege that comes with whiteness. What does whiteness mean? I usually have a little conversation, of course, in the classroom about what is whiteness. Whiteness is the center of our culture in which everything is compared to by other racial groups and ethnic groups. Whiteness is white people are typically not self-aware of their own privilege. And Peggy McIntosh calls this an invisible knapsack that white people carry as their privilege. And there's a burden that goes along with the knapsack that African Americans have to carry. Sociologist David Pager says about whiteness, "It is not that white Americans have not worked hard and built much. We have, but we did not start off from scratch. We went to segregated schools and universities built with public money. We received school loans, VA loans, housing and auto loans when people of color were excluded or heavily discriminated against. We received federal jobs, military jobs, and contracts when only whites were allowed. We were accepted into apprenticeships, training programs, and unions when access for people of color was restricted and non-existent." So we're talking about, you think about we are removed from segregation by just, 5 decades. And so we still have, of course, that generation still around. The baby boomer generation is definitely, the fruits of what was happening during segregation. So you have a little comical relief here. I'm done wearing a mask. It's been months of fearing for my safety when I leave the house, and of course African American men in particular know this fear all too well. Trying to feel that your whole life. So the paradox of race. Race is a social reality. It's manifested in our culture, as we've talked about, but it is a biological myth that does not exist physically, genetically, and that's what we want to deconstruct for a minute. And if you look at where the distribution of skin tones is spread throughout the world, you notice, of course, that there in the tropical regions you find the most darkest skin tone, and of course hominins ourselves, we evolved out of the tropics and we dispersed throughout the world. But the migration routes of our groups of people spread throughout, and we evolved variations to our biology in response to the environment that we were moving into. And so we had to have protection, of course, from the sun there in the tropical regions. And of course, in the northern regions, you need clothes for protection from the cold. But the skin tones change based upon the geographical location. So skin color is very, very strong. It's the boundary that our internal organs are protected by. It's really important to protect against the pressures of our environment. So this interface between body and environment is supported by the melanin, which melanin is we all have the ability to produce melanin. Is the pigmentation inside of the melanocyte cells, which are the cells in our epidermis, and we all have the same amount of melanocytes, but the size of those cells, as you see in the image on the left there, depends upon basically the environment and the need of the size. So the larger the size, then the darker the skin. So advantages to dark skin, well, it absorbs the ultraviolet radiation, which prevents the degradation of vitamin B, folate, and folate inadequacy is serious. It leads to maternal death and neural tube defection and various health issues that arise over time. Prevents damage to skin cells and the production of cancer. It is huge. It's really important for us to have. On the other hand, up north, you have the vitamin D issue. If you don't have enough sunlight, the stressor of the lack of sunlight can be just as devastating. Body makes only a certain amount of vitamin D, so it depends upon the ultraviolet radiation to synthesize your vitamin D, to activate it, in other words. It is essential to metabolizing calcium, of course, bone growth, and in our nervous system, and it very much is the foundation of our health. So what the adaptation is lighter skin, of course, to allow more ultraviolet light to come in. Light skin allows for more exposure and prevents vitamin T inadequacies. So prostate cancer and colon cancer, both the product of an inadequate amount of vitamin D. So there you go. It's a health issue, physical reality. So these categories of race, though, are very predominant in our society. It is, however, we've used this word arbitrary before, arbitrary, non-discrete, and it's based upon traits that are on a continuum. So if you were to walk from the tropics, say Africa, and up into northern Europe, you would see a change in gradation of skin tone based upon the change in the environment. You would not ever be able to see exactly this is where the black people stop and this is where the white people start. There would be a gradation, a change, a gradual change on a continuum. And so it's non-discrete. It's discrete, meaning it's very packaged, very much structured. You can see where the dark and the light break off from each other. That's not the case here. So So there's more genetic diversity, more genetic difference between any two members of a given race. So say you take African Americans and any two members, there's more diversity of a given race than between two members of any two different races. So there's more diversity within a race, within any particular race, than there are between races, which means that in essence, the categories of race are arbitrary. There's insignificant. We have our genetic similarities as a human race is something that we are more similar to each other than any other species. Any two penguins they have twice the amount of genetic diversity as humans. Any two fruit flies, they have 10 times as much genetic diversity. And that's because we've been mixing with each other genetically from the get-go. And today, even more so, as travel and ability to interact with different cultures has been escalated. So this category of race, though, if you look at other cultures, Brazil is a great example, which you have both Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans in Brazil, just like you have here. In Brazil, it's the Portuguese, of course. They had African slaves, and they had Native Americans, indigenous populations. But what they did not do is they did not say no intermixing. They encouraged actually the settlers, the Portuguese, to mix in with their the indigenous and the African population. So there was a mixture that was supported. Now there's some serious problems in Brazil as far as racial hierarchies, but nothing like what we have here. And Marvin Harris went and studied the Brazilians and found that there are actually over 200 different races. And he did this amazing study of making these composite drawings with facial features of different racial types. And he showed them to the Brazilians, and they named the different races. And he came up with 200 different races in his study. In the U.S., on the other hand, we have one drop blood history. We have this one drop blood. You either are or are not African descent, and that has been used during segregation and prior to keep African Americans in unstable and impoverished environments. So, yes. The structures of our society are something that is, this is the lineage that you can look at in housing. Housing is really important because if you think about segregation, segregation was just an overt effort to keep blacks in their place. Well, this was very much institutionalized, and what we see today in our neighborhoods is very much, well, a product of what happened in 1934, the establishment of the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration established long-term mortgages for people to move into the suburbs, and this was really even more escalated in the 1940s when the World War II vets came back from the war, and they had a serious housing shortage, so they really wanted to help the vets to get started with their families. And it used to be you had to put 50% down for a house. That was changed to just 10% down, and that's basically where we are today. And then you could pay over 30 years for the price of the house. Gave people that could not afford a house at the time a place to live. The only problem is that this was allowed for whites, but not allowed for blacks. And the federal government literally instituted what's called redlining apparatus, where the neighborhoods were ranked by color, green being all white and most stable, and red being integrated and having African Americans integrated in the community, and showing a destabilized neighborhood. So FHA actually supported this thing called redlining, and they would not even give loans to those neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods fell in disrepair as a result. You think about it, If you ever need to do some serious work on your house, what people do that don't have the money to do it, they'll reverse their mortgage. They'll play with their mortgage. And so African Americans were not allowed to do that, and their neighborhoods really fell into disrepair as a result. And the realtors were also part of this it was almost a conspiracy to keep neighborhoods segregated. This is from the National Association of Real Estate Brokers Code of Ethics. A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. So it was coded in their Code of Ethics. And so what happened with African Americans that came back, there were over 1 million black GIs out of World War II, and they attempted to get into these neighborhoods and were denied. But where they were placed is in public housing, and definitely what you see in the projects is a direct product of that. This is in Chicago, this amazing story of the African Americans being placed in what's called the Adgalf Gardens, where there were 53 toxic facilities, and 90% of the city's landfills. They built a housing project on top of that. To say the least, in Adgalf Gardens, the amount of cancer and birth defects, with kids being born with just incredible birth defects, was off the charts. But cancer definitely off the charts as well. They're living on top of a toxic dump. But that's an extreme example, but definitely that's not that's what we call environmental racism. But it is definitely something that you see across the country, because this is something that redlining was something that was a countrywide effort. In Chattanooga, they had what was the federal government unrolled what's called a Negro removal. It was even presented in Chattanooga as the Negro Removal Initiative. In 1939, authorities with the federal agency known as the Homeowners Loan Corporation unrolled a map of downtown Chattanooga, then using a scale of 5 different colors, graded each neighborhood as to whether it was worthy for real estate investment or if it wasn't. So does that sound familiar? Yes, it's exactly what was happening across the country. And the impact is something that is still playing out in our city. Yes, you can look at this. I'll try to put this on eLearn too. There's a great breakdown of redlining on from NPR that I'll present. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was instituted. The Equal Housing Opportunity was which created the Fair Housing Act, actually, which made redlining illegal. So basically, instead, what was happening after 1968, realtors were going around scaring white people by saying that black people are going to move into their neighborhood and send your property values down. The white families would calculate the other white families are going to leave and that property values were going to plummet. Of course, if 80% of the population is white, then suddenly 80% of the population is not interested in the housing anymore. People are going to move, and the property values would plummet. So this is called white flight, and it was a reaction to the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and realtors were basically in on this. And I'll play a little bit of what this has to say.
White flight or white exodus is the sudden or gradual large-scale migration of white people from areas becoming more racially or ethnoculturally diverse. In America, there have been 3 main reasons for the white flight, which we will explain in this video. We will start with the least controversial, economic reasons. During the 50s and beyond, when black people were able to afford homes in white suburban areas, the real estate industry, state courts, and the FHA adopted racist appraisal standards and restrictive covenant standards to keep them out. They argued that the purchase by an African American in a white neighborhood would cause the value of property to decline. There was no statistical proof for this, and the truth is because African Americans were forced to pay more than white families for comparable homes, the prices of homes would actually increase when an African American moved into the neighborhood. Regardless, because of these racist practices, real estate speculators were able to capitalize on white fears through the practice of blockbusting. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African American families at an above market price, then persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African American slums and that the value would soon fall, and then after convincing them, they would purchase the panicked whites' home for less than their worth. Blockbusters would hire African American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods. They would hire African American men to drive cars with radios blasting through the white neighborhoods. And they would even pay African American men to accompany their agents on knocking on white homes to pretend like they were looking for homes. Real estate firms then sold their newly acquired properties at inflated prices to African Americans. And because most black families could not qualify for mortgages through the FHA and banks due to racist policies, these real estate companies would sell them their homes on installment plans, where the African American earn no equity in the home and where they can take their home back if one payment was missed and repeat the scam with another black family. The second reason.
So the downward spiral of white flight was pretty well described here, and the property value, one black family say move into a white neighborhood, and the realtors would come in and say, hey, you know, you've got some colors moving into your block, and you know your values are going to go down. And you know, basically what was happening was that realtors were going around saying, you know, scaring white people, saying that black people are moving in, and of course, calculating that white families would move out and they would be able to buy the houses cheaply and then resell them to black people for a higher cost above the market level. And black people, of course, would be hampered by not being able to get a good loan, and you know, they would be deeper in debt, and it's quite a scandal. And that would spiral down into increasing the tax, property tax. As the overall wealth goes down, the property tax has to go up because you no longer have wealthy people in the neighborhoods to help fund the services. So property tax goes up, therefore property crimes go up, and you know, this is more policing presence, poverty goes up, and then you have in desperation, rock bottom, you have the need for something to be present, and you start to see things like prisons and factories start to come in the neighborhood to replace the absence. So in Chattanooga, this plays out quite exemplary in Cameron Hill, North Chattanooga, Southside, Highland Park. These are areas, except for Highland Park, which is just now starting to go through a lot of gentrification, but Cameron Hill, North Chattanooga, Southside were places in which you had, you used to have pretty much these were redlined areas. They were not, banks were not going to invest in them, so blacks ended up living there. And now, of course, as you know, this is where white people are gravitating towards and living, and blacks can no longer afford to live there. So it's a great article in the Chattanooga Times Free Press that plays out the split divide in our city. Goes into the poverty level of blacks, and our those low income neighborhoods are probably predominantly 70%, 75% black. The average poverty rate in those neighborhoods is 63%. You know, between 2000 and 2017, poverty increased dramatically for blacks, and their income level didn't, you know, whites almost double their income level, and blacks, did not. So great decline in home ownership as well in black communities. If you look in East Chattanooga, this map is probably something you might not be able to see very, very well, but I tried to make it large enough. If you see in this area right here, the Dotson Glass Street area, this is East Chattanooga that has no red signs. The red is where banks are. So banks have a rule that if they locate a neighborhood, they have to give a certain percentage of their loans to neighborhoods that they are located. Well, there are, like in neighborhoods all around the country, very few banks that locate in impoverished black neighborhoods. The poverty rate for Hamilton County for education is, we've got serious issues in this, so it's all connected. You've got jobs, you've got economic housing poverty, you've got food deserts where there's no grocery stores with quality food, and you've got educational problems. So in Chattanooga State, African Americans, you look from 2010 to 2007, they've improved their graduation rate from 2% in 2010 to 9% in 2017. White students from 11% to 24%. So again, we're talking about this poverty of education. And what we are really referring to as structural racism is institutionalized racism, institutionalized discrimination. And this is the accumulative effects of policy systems and processes that may not have been designed with racism in mind, but which have the effect of disadvantaging certain groups. This is what we call institutionalized structural racism. And you have to, when you look at discrimination, there might not be, and I asked the question, raise your hand if you're a racist. Most everybody in our class, I'm sure everybody will not raise their hand. I doubt it. I really doubt if anybody would raise their hand at Chattanooga State. However, that does not mean that racism does not exist, and total discrimination looks at the accumulation of past and present policies, the covert and overt actions of groups, institutions, and yes, as far as when we say covert versus overt, covert meaning what you don't see. It is looking at potentially the numbers of prison population and the fact that there's a majority of African Americans in prison, but they make up only 13, 14% of the population in the